In the midst of World War II, the United States Army Air Force bet on a daring doctrine, a strategy that many considered almost arrogant: strategic bombing by day. While their British allies chose the cover of night to hide their bombers, the Americans believed they had a weapon that could fly into the tiger's den in broad daylight and come back victorious. That weapon bore a name that would become legendary: the B-17, the Flying Fortress. It was more than just an airplane. It was a symbol of American industrial might, a 30-ton aluminum monster designed for one purpose: to deliver bombs to their targets and return alive. The name Flying Fortress was no exaggeration. With 13 50 caliber heavy machine guns mounted at every conceivable angle, nose, back, belly, waist, and tail, it was intended to be a flying steel porcupine, one capable of creating a defensive net of fire that no enemy fighter could penetrate. The theory on paper was perfect. By flying in tight combat box formations known as combat boxes, B-17s would provide each other with fire support. Imagine a three-dimensional aerial defense architecture where planes stacked on top of each other at different altitudes, creating overlapping fire zones, perfectly enveloping and protecting each other. The Americans believed that through sheer courage and firepower, they could deliver precision bombing raids on Nazi factories, railways, and manufacturing facilities, crippling Hitler's war machine from within. But the theory on paper, drawn up in safe rooms in Washington and London, was one thing. The reality in the fiery skies of Europe was quite another. There, the young American air crews faced a ruthless, experienced, and armed to the teeth enemy, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. It didn't take long for the predators of the German skies to find an answer to the Flying Fortresses. They were pilots who had been trained in battles in Spain, Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. They flew some of the best fighters in the world, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, fast and agile. And most terrifying of all, the Focke-Wulf 190, a heavily armed machine with a 20mm cannon, which the B-17 pilots gave the terrifying nickname the Raptors. German pilots quickly realized that attacking a B-17 from the rear or side was suicidal, so they developed a brutal and highly effective tactic: the frontal attack. They would form groups, fly high above the bomber formation, then dive at breakneck speed straight at the B-17s from the 12 o'clock direction. This was where the B-17's defensive firepower was at its thinnest, with just 2 nose guns and a dorsal turret. With a combined approach speed of over 500 miles per hour, the American gunners had only seconds to react. The German 20mm cannons could tear apart the cockpit, destroy the engine, and kill the pilot before he even realized he was under attack. For the young men inside those flying fortresses, each mission was a journey into hell. They endured the bitter cold at 25,000 feet, where temperatures could drop below -40 degrees. They breathed through cumbersome oxygen masks, constantly facing the risk of frostbite. And then the real hell began. First, black cauliflowers of anti-aircraft fire, called flak, exploded around them, sending razor-sharp metal fragments through the fuselage. Then the Raptors appeared. Imagine the chaos inside. Your 50 caliber machine gun roared in your ears, hot shell casings flying. The radio was filled with shouts, reporting enemy positions. You looked out the window and saw another B-17 in the formation. The plane of your friends you had just had breakfast with suddenly hit. An engine caught fire, then a giant fireball engulfed it, and no parachutes opened. The price was unimaginable. The goal of completing 25 missions to return home was no longer a milestone, but a suspended death sentence. The empty bed in the barracks became a silent reminder of the cost of the doctrine of daylight bombing. And in early 1943, one of the fiercest fronts of the air war was not in the industrial skies of Germany, but in the hot deserts and blue seas of North Africa. The Allies were in a life and death battle to push back General Erwin Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps. The key to choking Rommel was to cut off his supply lines, which flowed through the ports of Tunisia. For the B-17 squadrons based in dusty Algerian bases, the mission was clear: fly across the Mediterranean and bomb the ports of Tunis and Bizerte, reducing them to scrap metal. But these targets were defended by elite Luftwaffe squadrons, veterans of the Mediterranean theater who knew every inch of ground and sky. Every mission to Tunis was a bloody, nerve-wracking affair. It was in these forbidding skies that a crew and their flying fortress were about to face a test that stretched the limits of technique, courage, and survival itself. The plane's name was All-American. Among the hundreds of flying fortresses serving across the theaters, there was one B-17F, serial number 4124406. Its crew affectionately gave it a proud name, one that encapsulated their spirit, all-American. Commanding All-American and its 10 men was Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, a 24-year-old from North Carolina. Bragg was no reckless pilot, but a cool, competent young commander who had earned the complete trust of his crew, and that crew was a typical collection of wartime America. 10 men from big cities and small towns, from Midwestern farms to East Coast industrial neighborhoods. There were co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, mechanics, and gunners, each an indispensable cog in this complex war machine. They had endured grueling training together, shared letters from home, and faced death together in the skies over Europe. They were more than comrades, they were brothers, bound together by an invisible thread woven of trust and common danger. The morning of February 1st, 1943 began like any other morning at the dusty airbase at Biskra, Algeria. The chill of the pre-dawn desert seeped through the tents. Yellow lights shone from the barracks where the air crews were roused from their fitful sleep. There was no loud alarm, only a gentle shake of the shoulder. In the silence, one could feel a palpable tension. They dressed in silence, headed to the mess hall for a breakfast that none of them had an appetite for. Then came the briefing. The room suddenly hushed as the curtain was pulled back over the large map, and then the target was revealed: Tunis, a name that silenced even the most seasoned pilots. Tunis was more than a target, it was a fortress. Everyone knew it. Intelligence officers presented anti-aircraft gun positions, the number of German fighters believed to be operating in the area. The cold numbers painted a picture of a battle for survival. After the briefing, each man returned to his own rituals. Some wrote hasty notes to their families, letters that might be his last. Others obsessively checked their flying equipment, every lock, every oxygen tube. Then they walked together out onto the runway, where the metal giant slept under the dim starlight. All-American was there, calm and majestic. The mechanics had worked through the night-loading fuel, bombs, and thousands of .50 caliber rounds. Bragg's crew made a final round of their ship, touching the cold metal as a greeting, a promise to return together. They climbed into the aircraft through the narrow doors, each taking his place. Lieutenant Bragg took the pilot's seat, began the pre-flight check, his calm voice coming over the radio, a reassurance to all. Their target, the port of Tunis, was the jugular vein of the Africa Corps. Through it, Rommel received tanks, ammunition, fuel, and men. Severing this artery would end the war in North Africa months earlier, but the Luftwaffe knew it too. They had turned the skies over Tunis into a hornet's nest of Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, ready to pounce on anything that dared to invade their airspace. And then the order was given. One by one, then by another, the Wright Cyclone engines roared to life, waking the desert. The roar of nearly 80 B-17s, equivalent to 320 engines, created a symphony of power that shook the ground. All-American began to taxi, laden with tons of bombs and fuel, and slowly accelerated down the runway. With a slight jerk, it lifted off the ground, rising into the dawn African sky. In the air, it joined its sister planes. They slowly arranged themselves into perfect battle box formations, a majestic spectacle of power and discipline. Dozens of flying fortresses, glittering in the morning sun, flew east, toward the Mediterranean, toward Tunis. They were flying toward inevitable confrontation, toward a destiny that none of the 10 men on board the All-American could have imagined, a destiny that would etch their names and their ship into the annals of valor. The flight over the Mediterranean was carried out in a tense silence. Below them lay the azure waters, a peaceful beauty in stark contrast to what they were about to face. Over the radio, only brief professional announcements of coordinates, speed, and altitude were given. Each crew member kept their eyes fixed on their assigned space, young eyes scanning the endless blue sky, looking for the tiny black dots that signaled the arrival of the Grim Reaper. And then they appeared. Enemy aircraft heading 2 o'clock. A gunner's voice rang out sharply, breaking the silence. At first they were just small dots, but they grew larger with terrifying speed. The Luftwaffe had arrived. There was no circling or circling like in the movies. The German pilots carried out their tactics with cold, precise precision. Blocks of Bf-109s swooped down from the sun, a classic trick to blind the gunners. Instantly, the B-17 formations came to life. Hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns opened fire, creating a dense rain of bullets. The calm sky was suddenly torn apart by streaks of orange fire and plumes of black smoke from the machine guns. Inside the All-American, the air was thick. The gunners clung to their guns, their bodies shaking with each volley. They shouted out enemy positions, working together, trying to create an impenetrable net of fire. A BF-109 swooped in, unleashing a barrage of 20mm shells. Lieutenant Bragg felt the jolts as the bullets pierced the wings, but fortunately missed vital parts. The gunner in the dorsal turret, Sergeant Joe Traficante, had the German plane in his sights. He pulled the trigger. A long burst of bullets went straight into the cockpit of the BF-109. The enemy plane stopped, belched a plume of black smoke, and then lurched into the sea. A small victory, but no time to celebrate. Two other BF-109s broke away from the main formation, deciding to attack the All-American head-on. This was the most terrifying scenario. Bragg held the helm, while the two nose gunners returned fire frantically. One of the BF-109s was hit. It seemed its engine had failed, and it began to spin out of control. But instead of swerving to escape, it continued to charge. Perhaps the pilot was seriously injured or dead, his hand still clutching the control stick. Perhaps, in a final act of defiance, he wanted to take his enemy with him. No one could know for sure. The out-of-control BF-109 flew right over the All-American's cockpit, narrowly missing. The crew held their breath. They had made it. But then, from below, disaster struck. The second BF-109, the one that hadn't been hit, had miscalculated its dive. Instead of flying over, it was flying too low. There was no time to react. There was no warning cry. There was only a terrible sound, a roach of tearing metal, a sound no one on board All-American had ever heard before and would never forget. The entire 30-ton aircraft shook violently as if struck by a giant hand. People were thrown from their seats. Pieces of metal were flying everywhere. The BF-109 had not hit directly. In a split second, it passed below, and its steel-like right wing acted like a giant knife, cutting a clean cut into the left rear fuselage of the B-17 just in front of the tail gunner. The German plane, with one wing shattered, lurched and exploded in a ball of fire, but it had left a fatal wound. Inside the All-American, utter chaos reigned. The impact had thrown the plane off balance instantly. It lurched violently and then nosedived, nose down toward the sea. The altimeter needle spun wildly. 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet. They were falling like a rock. Lieutenant Bragg and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Harry Sekov, put all their strength into the controls, trying to pull the nose up. Their muscles tensed. Their tendons stood out. The steering wheel vibrated violently in their hands, almost useless. From the cockpit, they could not make out what had happened. The radio system was erratic with indistinct screams. Every warning light on the control panel was flashing. They only knew one thing: their ship was dying. At the rear, in the bomb bay and the waist gunners' positions, the scene was a nightmare. A huge hole had opened in the fuselage, big enough to drive a car through. The wind howled inside with hurricane force, sucking up anything that wasn't anchored. The temperature dropped dramatically. Through the hole, they could see the sky and the sea swirling below. And then they saw it. A scene so absurd their brains refused to accept it. The tail of the All-American had been torn apart, almost severed from the fuselage. It was bent at an odd angle, swinging wildly in the wind, connected to the rest of the plane only by a few struts and a thin piece of skin on the belly. The left horizontal stabilizer was gone completely, sliced off by the BF-109's blade. The tail's about to break. Oh God, the tail's about to break! A terrified voice screamed over the radio. The tail gunner, Sergeant Sam Sarpolis, was trapped. He was completely isolated in his glass cage, watching the fuselage tear apart in front of him. There was no way back. He could only sit there, helpless, watching the tail shake violently, waiting for the moment it would break off and hurl him and the metal into the sea. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Bragg, after a heroic effort, finally pulled the nose up, breaking the dive. The plane was level for the moment, but it lurched like a badly wounded animal. Every rule, every training, every survival instinct screamed one thing: eject. This plane was dead. It was no longer a flying fortress, it was a flying metal coffin, seconds from shattering into pieces. Bragg reached for the button to activate the eject alarm, but then he stopped. Through the whistling of the wind and the roar of the engines, he could sense something, a faint vibration from the stick. The plane was still responding, if only slightly. He glanced at his co-pilot, and in their eyes, a mad decision, a decision that defied all logic had been made. He would not abandon his ship. He would not abandon the gunner trapped in the back. Nobody's bailing out. Bragg's voice came over the radio, uncannily calm in the chaos. We're bringing it home. If you find it interesting, please comment number 2. Thank you very much. Lieutenant Bragg's command came over the radio like a phantom. We're taking it home. For the crew, it was both a glimmer of hope and a near-certain death sentence. Abandoning the plane in this condition was a rational act. Attempting to fly it was an act of blind faith. But faith in their commander was the only thing they had left. The war with the Luftwaffe was over. Now a new, more terrifying war had begun. A war against their own ship and the laws of physics. The All-American, separated from its formation, was now alone in the sky. It flew strangely, like a bird with a broken wing, its torn tail hanging low and swaying dangerously in the wind. Bragg and Seekov struggled in the cockpit. The plane was constantly tilting and pitching. It took all their strength to keep it level, sweat pouring off their flight suits despite the biting cold. It was a miracle, or rather a testament to the resilience of Boeing's design, that they were still airborne. The impact had torn almost the entire rear fuselage apart, destroying the hydraulic system and severing most of the control cables. However, the elevator control cables, the crucial part that allowed the plane to pitch the nose up or down, were designed to run along the ceiling of the fuselage. In an incredible stroke of luck, despite the severe damage, 2 of these cables were still intact. They stretched like strings through the giant hole. They were the fragile threads that literally held the lives of 10 men. But controlling the altitude wasn't enough. They could barely control the direction. Every time Bragg tried to turn slightly, the damaged tail would vibrate violently, threatening to break off. And then, in the midst of their despair, a bright idea came to them. The mechanic, Sergeant Tipton, realized they could try another way to control the plane. Over the radio, a mad plan was hatched. They would use their own body weight. Bragg ordered the waist gunners and the radio operator to move. When he wanted to turn right, they would run to the right side of the fuselage. When he wanted to turn left, they would run to the left. It was a dance of survival, a primitive and desperate attempt to replace the destroyed controls. Bit by bit, slowly and painfully, they steered the wounded monster back toward Algeria. They faced another enemy, the hurricane-force wind that howled through the hole in the fuselage. Not only did it slow him down, it created a terrible drag, constantly trying to tear the tail apart. The crew used everything they could find, spare flight jackets, parachute bags, empty ammunition boxes, to try to plug the hole. It was a desperate effort, like bailing water from the sea, but it gave them something to do, a way to fight. Meanwhile, in the rear, tail gunner Sam Sarpaulis was living the longest and loneliest 90 minutes of his life. Trapped in the tail compartment, he was completely isolated. He could see his crewmates through the hole, only a few meters away, but it felt like an eternity. They tried to throw him a rope, but the wind was too strong. Sarpaulis could only sit there, clutching his machine gun, watching the tail shake violently. Each shake was a reminder that he was sitting on a time bomb. He prayed, he watched, and he waited. He accepted his fate. The return journey was a race against time. The All-American was flying much slower than normal, making it an easy target. Fortunately, the German fighters had retreated after the initial attack, but every cloud turbulence, every sudden gust of wind was a mortal threat. Bragg had to fly with extreme gentleness, feeling every vibration of the plane, listening to the groan of the metal under pressure. It was no longer piloting skill, it was art, an almost spiritual connection between pilot and his dying machine. An hour and a half passed like a century, and then, through the clouds, a sight they had not dared hope to see again, the brown expanse of the African coast. They had made it. They had crossed the sea, but the final and most difficult challenge was still ahead, landing. They flew towards Biskra base. Bragg calmly radioed the emergency. On the ground, all activity stopped. Fire trucks and ambulances, sirens blaring, rushed to their ready positions beside the runway. People poured out of their tents and looked up at the sky, not believing what they were hearing. When All-American appeared, a hush fell over the base. The sight was surreal. A B-17 was flying without a tail. It flew strangely, looking more like a broken toy than a war machine. Everyone thought they were witnessing its final moments. In the cockpit, Bragg and Seekov prepared for a nearly impossible landing. They had no effective brakes. The hydraulic system had failed, meaning the landing gear would not lower. They could not slow down normally because flying too slowly would cause the plane to lose lift and crash. And most frightening of all, the shock of landing would almost certainly break the tail off. Bragg decided to land on his belly. He circled wide, approaching the runway very carefully and slowly. The crew had been ordered to move all the way forward to gain weight, hoping to keep the tail in the air as long as possible. "Bring impact!" Bragg shouted. The All-American skidded across the runway, lower and lower. Its belly hit the ground with a sickening screech of crushed metal. A shower of sparks flew behind it. The plane slid, out of control, spinning violently. The frail tail finally broke off and flew off to the side. The main fuselage continued sliding for hundreds of meters before coming to a stop in a cloud of dust and smoke. For the first moment, there was deathly silence, and then a door opened. A soldier stepped out, then another, then another. They were staggering, shaking, exhausted, but alive. 10 men, all 10, including tail gunner Sam Sarpelis, who had been rescued from the broken tail section. As the last soldier stepped out of the wreckage, a cheer erupted from the soldiers watching on the ground. They had witnessed more than just a landing. They had witnessed a miracle. When the dust cleared, the scene on the Biskra runway was incredible. The main fuselage of the All-American lay there, a mass of twisted, silent metal. Not far away, the tail section had been broken off, like a discarded toy. All around were debris and deep plow marks in the ground, but amid the destruction stood the image of 10 men standing together, examining each other's wounds, hugging each other in an emotional silence. They had been to hell and back. As soon as the crew was confirmed safe, a wave of amazement spread through the base. Engineers, ground crew, and other pilots rushed to the wreckage. They circled it, the experienced mechanics shaking their heads in disbelief. They touched the jagged tiers, looked at the huge gap where the tail had been. Everything they knew about aerodynamics, about aircraft construction, told them this was impossible. A senior engineer, after a thorough examination of the wreckage, uttered a quote that will forever be remembered. "It's unbelievable. This plane only flies thanks to God and 2 control cables." He was not exaggerating. This plane had defied the laws of physics, and it had won. In the chaos, military photographers recognized the historical significance of this moment. They rushed to the scene, cameras in hand, and began capturing images that would become immortal. They captured the giant hole, the broken tail, and most importantly, the faces of the 10 heroes. Those black and white photos, sharp and emotional, perfectly captured the brutality of the battle and the extraordinary endurance of both man and machine. These photos were quickly sent back to headquarters. The senior officers, upon seeing them, immediately recognized the value of this story. In a total war, morale is a weapon, and the story of All-American was a powerful morale booster. It was stamped priority and sent straight to Washington. Soon the story and images of All-American became a phenomenon across America. Major newspapers carried them on their front pages. Magazines like Life devoted pages to recounting the fateful flight. It became a perfect propaganda tool, more powerful than any poster. The story served 2 important purposes. First, it bolstered the morale of the people back home. Amid the news of casualties and bloody battles, here was a story of victory, of survival against unimaginable odds. It showed the courage, resilience, and extraordinary skill of their sons, husbands, and fathers fighting far away. It transformed ordinary soldiers into legendary heroes. Second, and perhaps equally important, it was invaluable advertising for the B-17 itself and the defense industry. Aircraft manufacturers like Boeing used the story to demonstrate the incredible durability of their products. It sent a powerful message. Our flying fortress may be damaged, but it will not fall. It will bring your sons and daughters home. This message boosted the morale of factory workers who toiled day and night to produce the aircraft and encouraged the American people to buy more war bonds to finance the war effort. And what of the All-American itself? There was no attempt to repair it. The damage was too extensive, too catastrophic, but it was not discarded as a scrap metal pile. Engineering teams did something significant. They carefully dismantled the plane, piece by piece. The working engines, the machine guns, the electronics, the undamaged hull, all were taken out to be installed in other B-17s. Ships that would continue the fight. Like a badly wounded soldier, All-American donated its organs to save the lives of its comrades. Its ultimate mission was not to drop bombs, but to give life. As for Lieutenant Bragg's crew, they were hailed as true heroes. They were awarded the highest medals, but perhaps their greatest reward was that they survived. Together they completed their tour of North Africa, a feat few had ever achieved, and eventually returned home. Their story is told over and over again, in training camps, in pilots' bars, and in homes across America. They have become part of legend, the men who rode on a torn ship and flew through the door of death. The story of the All-American is more than just the story of a single mission. It is a crucial piece a glorious chapter in the larger saga of the Boeing B-17 flying fortress. It is stories like these, of planes returning with hundreds of bullet holes, with damaged engines, with torn wings, that build an immortal legend. The B-17 is not remembered simply as an efficient war machine. It is loved as a faithful companion, a ship with a soul, a mother who always tried her best to bring her children home safely, no matter how badly damaged she herself was. This legend gave hope to tens of thousands of pilots who put their faith in the strength of the ship they piloted. But the magic of the All-American lay in more than steel braces or aluminum skin. Its true legacy is a powerful reminder that, even in the most mechanized warfare, the human element is always decisive. An aircraft, no matter how well designed, is just a lifeless mass of metal. It was Lieutenant Bragg's extraordinary calm and masterful piloting, the perfect coordination and discipline of his crew, and the 10 men's unwavering will to survive that turned a certain disaster into an impossible feat. They had not merely flown a plane, they had infused it with life, subjected it to their will, and forced it to fly when every law of physics said it should crash. It is important, however, to place this inspiring story in its larger tragic context. All-American was a sparkling drop in an ocean of blood. It was a ray of hope in an extremely brutal air war. While Bragg's crew lived to tell their tale, thousands of other B-17s were not so lucky. Nearly 5,000 flying fortresses were lost in combat in the European theater alone. More than 47,000 aircrew became casualties, including more than 26,000 who died. For every story of miraculous survival, there were hundreds more that ended in flames and smoke on unfamiliar fields. The story of All-American is thus not only a song of victory, but also a silent tribute to the countless men who did not return. Today, warfare has changed. Strategic bombers fly higher, faster, and are guided by technologies unimaginable to Bragg's crew. But the special bond between man and machine in the life or death moments remains. Occasionally, at air shows around the world, one can still hear the distinctive roar of Wright Cyclones. One of the few remaining airworthy B-17s will glide overhead, a majestic ghost from the past. And when we see it, we see more than just an old plane. We see the story of All-American. We see images of Lieutenant Bragg struggling with the controls, images of gunners running back and forth to steady the ship, and images of Sam Sarpalus sitting alone in the tail about to break off. The story of All-American is ultimately not a story of war, but of human will. It is an enduring testament that even in the face of certain destruction, amid chaos and despair, the human spirit can find a way to survive. It is not only a feat of aeronautical engineering, but one of the greatest stories of courage and resilience ever told. A story of 10 men and their shattered ship who together flew through the gates of death and survived to tell us that sometimes miracles do happen. History is not only written by strategists on the map, but also by the extraordinary courage of soldiers in the trenches. Stories like this, of camaraderie and survival against the impossible, deserve to be told and remembered. If you join us on this journey of discovering forgotten pages of history, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.